I'm back, and this time I'm talking about um, World War One. Okay, and World War One, it's been called the Great War, the war to end all wars, but yet it often gets overshadowed by World War Two, and I think it's a really important war for a number of reasons. Okay, it was it was the very first modern war, very first World War. Well, I know Winston Churchill called the 30 Years' War the first, or the 7 Years' War, 7 Years' War, the first World War. But this was truly a total world war. Okay, and it was a very modern one. So all that technology that I talked about, um, that really played a big part in this. So it was a war that in many ways, and I know they say that the military leaders are always fighting the last war. The war, that the strategies that they used, especially at the beginning of the war, were totally out of sync with the weaponry and stuff that they had. Okay, um, it 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 was very devastating, both on a human level, especially, but also even with the destruction of the land and the economies and the countries that it destroyed. Okay, so it was just it it, it was hugely destructive, and it didn't really do anything. Okay, so what were the causes of the war? Well, in many ways, it's the stuff that we've been reading about, but it's the rivalry. Think especially about the rivalry, the nationalism, and all of that. So these great powers, um, they believed that uh, they had to have big armies, large armies, so they were really big, and that meant significant economies, industrial bases. Industrializing, to build all the, make all the weaponry and stuff, and they were expanding into these global empires. So um, they were willing to risk war, but they always thought that it wasn't going to be a long war, right? They did not want a repeat of the Napoleonic Wars, and and that was really the last major one. Okay, there was the Crimean War, but those were fairly quick, right? And limited in region, especially the Crimean War. The Napoleonic period, yes, he was all over Europe, right? Um, but so national interests, nationalism, but also the way that they created all of these, and they're all related, right? So they created all of these uh, they create sorry, heard something. They created alliances. So they were, and some of them were known, some of them were not as known. But basically, we had Europe aligning with each other. So we had Germany, who aligned with the Austrian Empire. And I didn't really talk about the Austrian Empire in the last one, but they're kind of having their problems too, right? So we have Germany and Austria, the empire. Then we had Russia and France. And then, well, we did. Great Britain was actually kind of not interested in fighting in the war, but it was unable to start because to stay out of it because they had been given the task of protecting Belgium. Okay, so there was the Triple Entente of Russia, France, and Britain. By the time the war started, and the Central Powers of Germany and Austria. Italy originally was with the Central Powers, and then it switched over, okay, to join the Entente. But those were the two sides. And once the whole thing started, then it was like a domino effect or a house of cards, right? So like I said, nationalism is really important. I'm probably going to repeat that a couple of times, but because a lot of this was this patriotism, and so they were willing to go to war to protect themselves, right? So those are really the important causes, the alliances, the nationalism, patriotism, all of that stuff. Now, the spark. The spark was the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Okay, so he was the heir to the Habsburg throne, but uh, there were, parts of the Austrian Empire who wanted to be independent, and Serbia had just become a new nation, had broken away from the Ottoman Empire, but they wanted to unite the rest of the Balkan states together. And some of those fell under the Austrian Empire. So they felt like Austria stood in the path. Um, Serbian nationalists were very much interested in achieving their goals, and so there was a kind of terrorist group, kind of really terrorist group called the Black Hand, and they trained people who were ethnically Serbian to carry out assassinations, and they basically were said they said any Austrian politician that you can, if you get the chance, you do this. And so when Franz Ferdinand and his wife came to visit the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo, they felt like they had the chance. And uh, they had actually a number of attempts that day, but finally one of them was successful. Okay. And so, that was the spark. So Austria kind of called on their friend Germany on their blank check and said, "You're going to help us, right?" And then, pretty soon they were at war. Okay. Um, the people in Europe thought that it was going to go very quickly, but it didn't. It quickly became mired down. They had all these new weapons that were very different, and so to protect themselves against that, they started they were much more effective. I said different, much more effective. So they dug trenches. Okay. Well, once they started digging trenches, and at first they were like just quickly dig a trench, but then they became quite elaborate. But once they started doing that, then there's it's very difficult to move the line. It's very difficult because they had to go, in the British term, over the top, up over the top, to cross no man's land to try to get to the trench of the opposite side and fight them. So that was pretty difficult. So there was very little movement and just a lot of fighting. Now Germany did have a plan. So it began with what they called the Schlieffen Plan, where they would go through Belgium, attack France very quickly, conquer them, and then turn around and go fight Russia. That was the Schlieffen Plan, and they thought it'll take Russia a while to get their military up to speed. Well, there were a couple of problems with that, right? And so Russia actually did get their act together much faster than that, right? Um, and so that plan didn't really work. And then it evolved on the Western Front into the trench warfare. Okay, um, there were a number of battles that were major offensive, where just hundreds of thousands of people died, and really not much progress was made. So it became a war of attrition, especially on the Western Front. The Eastern Front was a little bit different. Okay, the Eastern Front didn't have the same kind of trench warfare, and it took place more over in the Ottoman Empire, that area, Crimea, those areas, and there were some major battles over there, and One of the reasons that we call this a world war is because, as I talked about with imperialism, these were empires. These powers had empires. So the British pulled people to fight for them from India, from South Africa, from all of their empire, right? From Australia and Canada and on and on and on. And so did the French. The French brought up people from Morocco and places like that. So everybody was it became very much of a world war. And I mention that here because it was the Australians who were fighting a lot, who lost a lot of people on the Eastern Front. Okay. Um, a lot of that was in the area of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, and it was, basically the British especially led the invasion. Okay, and they captured the eastern part of the empire, and by the end of the war, the Ottoman forces were just completely in chaos, and the collapse of the empire was certain. Now, this war, as I said, had turned into a war of attrition, and basically, um, kind of what gave the Entente the edge was when the Americans finally joined. Okay, not because the Americans were a better army. They were probably as good, but not necessarily better. But they were fresh, and so they came in and kind of pushed it over the edge. Well, they had been helping Britain for a while, providing military supplies, money, loans, that sort of thing. One of the things about a total war is that, so I talked about how it was a world war, but it's also called a total war. And that's because it involves all aspects of these societies. So not just their militaries, but the home front too. So the home front were the people that were working to make all of these weapons, and the fact that the home front, they rationed food, so there was food to send to the front lines, and all of the economies and all of the businesses kind of shifted over to support, all of the war efforts. Okay, and actually that happened after the United States. It been happening kind of behind the scenes, but then it happened, with the U.S. in the same way once they joined the war. But the other reason for thinking about the war as a total war is because of the role that women played, and women played a huge role. Um, and they stepped up and they went to the factories and worked or did other jobs that men had done, but they were gone. And they also were nurses on the front line or drove ambulances or, very close to the front lines. So, all of the segments of the population, participated, and it really was in many ways a turning point for women. There are a lot of people who will say that the fact that the women, in many of the Western nations, like in the United States and Britain and some other places, got the vote after World War One was because they stepped up and they proved that they had what it took to be, a citizen. Not it didn't happen everywhere. Okay, it didn't happen in France, for example, for a long time. Okay, and right at the end of the war, we had the pandemic, the Spanish influenza of 1918, and it infected something like a half of a billion people, and which at that time was about a third of the planet's population. And a lot of people died. So a lot of people died in this war, period. Okay. Just a whole lot of people. And this was one reason why. And the rest of the aftermath of the war is that it ended three of the most the three powerful empires: the Russian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Um, France and Great Britain just kind of, divvied up, especially the Ottoman Empire. They divvied them up in a mandate system. Okay, so they were supposed to kind of help them create new independent nations and achieve, independence eventually, sort of thing. But they kind of just used them for whatever they wanted to use them for, right? Turkey did become independent, and there was a revolution in Russia that led to the collapse of the Tsar and his government, and the installation of the communist regime that we'll talk about later. Okay. The war, toward the end of the war, they started using poison gas as well. So the trenches, the poison gas, the way that the war was fought, and just the horror of it, led to a lot of what at that time they called shell shock, what we call PTSD today. But it also, wiped out entire generations. Just, huge numbers of men did not come back from the war. So it was in many ways a very destructive war. And the way that the war ended with the treaty and the way that Germany was treated, and we'll look at all of that later, but that kind of contributed to what happened. I mean, it was not a good peace after the war, at all. So, but we'll look more at those in a little bit.